Okay, good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to this event on higher education, which we from IEG, I'm Caroline Heider, the Director General of IEG, and our dear colleagues from the Education Global Practice are organizing together. I will give some opening remarks, some welcome remarks, and then we have with us our dear friend Jaime Saavedra, who will be actually giving the opening remarks. He's the Senior Director of Education, so he is the specialist in education. I'm the specialist in evaluation, so I will take a little bit of a different perspective. And then we will be followed by a presentation of the evaluation findings by Emanuela Di Gropolo from our side before our panel discussion starts, which will be moderated by Auguste Kwame. So when we look at higher education and why did IEG actually evaluate this, we need to understand that in a larger context. We were evaluating at the same time competitiveness, industry competitiveness and jobs, and education, skilled labor, a workforce that's highly educated is one of the things that are making countries competitive, making industries competitive, making enterprises highly successful. So we wanted to look at the counterpart piece and understand, so what is the World Bank Group doing in higher education? How well is that working? Where are sort of like the leading edge questions that the World Bank Group has to answer? And Emanuela will present to you the findings, which really point to some fundamental strategic questions that the World Bank Group has to consider. At the same time, the World Development Report on education came out just around the same time or shortly after we had published our evaluation, so we could actually feed into the shaping of the final messages by providing our evaluation findings and connecting evaluation with research and ensuring that we establish some linkages. And many of you would know the next World Development Report is on the role of work, which is again connected to all of this. Because when we think ahead of time and when we think about what people call the fourth industrial revolution, it really requires a big shift in our thinking about work, about jobs, about employment. Why is that so? The fourth industrial revolution basically foresees that artificial intelligence and robots will do a lot of work. They will do a lot of the manual work where you can automate things, but increasingly robots are able to learn. And so that will mean they will move more into sophisticated spaces that typically we would say only human beings can do. And that is in the face of an ever-increasing workforce. More and more young people are looking for jobs. They need employment. Do they have the right skills? Are we investing in education systems that prepare them for potentially a completely different work environment and different opportunities so that they can be successful? And that is why this evaluation is so important, to stimulate a discussion here at the World Bank Group and hopefully beyond, to say, like, what needs to change? How can we invest in this? And where can we build on the strengths of the World Bank Group? And where does the World Bank Group really have to shift the needle? So with that, I'd like to hand over, first of all, to Jaime, and then we will hear from Emanuela afterwards. So welcome, Jaime.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and many thanks for creating this space and this opportunity to have a discussion on an area which is critical for the for our work, right? And with the education practice, we see from early childhood education up to tertiary and lifelong learning. So, I mean, it's this is extremely big agenda, and what I wanted to discuss more than the evaluation of the world of the bank is what are those issues that worry us and where we should continue focus our efforts. in a context in which we see that there is a huge demand for tertiary education, I will risk saying that in many of the developing world, it's more of a demand on the university side, larger than the demand on the technical side, which that doesn't mean that that's correct, but that seems to be a fact. Actually, I think it's bad that that's happening that way, but that's what's happening. And when there is a demand, there is a supply. And what we do see is that there has been a match between that rise in demand and the supply. And in some cases have been the public sector, but in many cases have been the private sector who has chipped in and has increased dramatically the supply in many countries. And we see that in South Asia, we see that in Latin America, we see that in Africa. The numbers in India, for instance, are mind-boggling in terms of the numbers of new tertiary institutions that are created per week, right? And the increase is extremely high. But with that increase comes the challenge of what's happening in those institutions, right? So there's more enrollment, higher quantity, and it rings a bell, that issue of increasing quantity, not necessarily with quality, right? And I see Halsey here, who's led the report with Dion Filmer on basic education, and we had a problem in basic education, right? There was a trade-off between quantity and quality, right? Enrollments expanded, quantity is up, but quality is not up. So and that's why now we have that, we can say, unfortunately, that schooling is not learning. When we say schooling is not learning, basically is that we have increasing in quantity without without having the same time, the same increase in the quality of the service in that case. Seems to me that something similar might be happening in tertiary education. And probably as same as in basic, the other thing that we see in tertiary education is that this increase in the supply has come with a huge increase in the heterogeneity of the quality of that supply, right? In many countries, we see a huge increase in private offer, for instance. In some cases, fantastic new universities or technical institutes, and in other cases, just a plain scam, just diploma mills in which students are paying their money, usually little money, sometimes not that little, not learning anything, but this is just a diploma mill, so eventually 5 years later, they will have a diploma saying something. The graduation will be fantastic, right? I mean, there's always the toga, the whole thing, that will be fantastic. But how much they have learned? Probably very little, very little. And so that creates a huge challenge for us. And just from what I said, there are several challenges already. So if there's an increase in heterogeneity in the quality, that means that, well, as we can suspect, many of our people who are in this room are economists, this is a very imperfect market, right? So imperfect markets require regulation, right? As in the same way that we have regulation in telecoms, in mining, etc., in all the public services in which we have an intervention of the private sector, sometimes very good intervention of the private sector, but it is a market that has to be regulated. And that happens with tertiary education as well. Is that easy? No. But nobody said that public policy is easy. It's very difficult, right? But that is a critical challenge that we have. And in tertiary education in particular, I think it's extremely welcome, the participation of the private sector, from many perspectives, right? From the perspective of, well, we need capital, we need people to put money and invest. In many cases, the public budgets will not be enough to do that. We also need the intervention of the private sector, not necessarily of the education private sector, but the rest of the productive sector, because I mean, to make higher education, both on the university side and on the technical side, pertinent, we need to make sure that there is a very good collaborative work between the university, the technical institutes, and the business sector. The other challenge that we have relates to what I was saying at the beginning, that this increase in demand has been biased towards the university, which is probably a mistake. Why is that happening? maybe because the marketing of the universities is very good, maybe just because there has been, for whatever reason that I don't understand, this perception from families that the way to go is to have a university diploma. I mean, you make it, right? If you do have a university diploma. If you don't, well, it's because you were not able to, right? So it's kind of the technical degrees are the poor cousin of the university degrees, right? Something that we don't see in many European countries. There's not that perception, right? And hence, they have a much better and healthy balance between technical education and university education. Moreover, I mean, in Austria, Germany, the Netherlands, you will have more 60-40, where 60 would be the technical and 40 the universities, right? And what we see in the developing world is a huge increase in, when we talk about tertiary education, a huge increase, and in many cases we see that 80% or 90% of the increase of the delta is on the universities enrollment and not on the technical side. Now, both worlds, university side, the technical side, face huge challenges, right? And we are engaging with many of our client countries in those challenges. And when we talk about and we discuss about universities, universities should be, first of all, they're about teaching and learning, right? But are they only about teaching and learning, or they have to be also about research? They have to be about research, or there's discussion, can they be only about teaching and learning? And in some cases could be about research, some cases not. That's a big discussion in many countries, and it seems that as in many cases, as in many things of life, there's no right or wrong, right? All the linkage that we need to continue fostering between universities and the productive sector, so that they are strong on the research side, but it's research that immediately is connected to the needs of the country and is a research that can be used by the business sector in order to find solutions to the technological challenges that they have. Universities have to, we need to have always this discussion about equity. I mean, who should be, and how do we make sure that universities are also an element that brings social cohesion in countries, and such that we make sure that everyone has the opportunity, independently of their income, everyone has the opportunity to receive a high quality university education. So many things that I'm sure the panel will have all the solutions. And on the other hand, on the technical university, on the technical side, same thing, right? We talk about the fourth industrial revolution. We talk about all the 21st century competencies that students should have, and they should get them in the universities and in the technical in technical institutes. And my final point is that actually when we talk about universities here and technical institutes there, it's a dichotomy that is probably wrong, right? And it is a dichotomy that probably is also led by the fact that when we work with our client countries, most likely there will be a ministry, right, that it's about universities. Right? So we discussed with that minister and he said, I really want to do a university reform. And we say, no, but it has to be also about technical institutes, but that's not my business. I mean, my mandate is only about universities. And it will be another ministry, it will be the labor ministry, the skills ministry, whatever it's called, that it's in charge of the technical world. That dichotomy is a problem. I think that dichotomy is a problem. Because at the end of the day, should be a continuum from the 2-month course to the 6-month certificate to the 2-year diploma, the 4-year polytechnic, the 5-year BA, the PhD. So it should be a continuum on one hand in terms of that offer. And on the other side, it should be many avenues that relate to each other a long time. Because we need to give space to people to, at the beginning of their lives after secondary, decide, I want this, but then 10 years later, I want that. First, I want a diploma, then I want to do a BA, or the other way around. I want to do this BA on whatever, in philosophy, and then I say, no, but I also want to do this diploma in whatever, in robotics. Why not, right? And now, what we have in many countries is that someone at 18 years, when it's 18 or 17, usually a moment in your life in which you don't have a clue of what the hell you want to do, you still need to decide either I go this highway or I go that highway, and those highways never cross, and that is a problem. So I haven't given any solution to anything, but what you can see is that this is a really exciting field in which the challenge that we have is that we need to try to find solutions every day with our client countries, because I mean they have to take decisions, right? I mean, one can say, well, I need to study, but if you're on the other side of the table and you're a minister, so well, you can study and do all your research papers you want or your analytical work, but I go to Congress in a month, right? And I have to say something there, right? So we need to balance those two things. And I mean, this type of evaluation work of the analytics that have been happening in the bank, the operations of the bank, give us good lessons so that we're better prepared to support the work with the governments and try to make progress in this arena, which is something that, as you all know here, is absolutely crucial, both for the development of the countries, but also for the welfare and the future of many young people. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Sorry. Good afternoon to all. So it's a pleasure to be here today to present some of the main findings of the IEG evaluation on the World Bank Group support to higher education. This evaluation has been completed recently and already discussed and shared, but here is an opportunity to launch it a little bit more formally. It basically covers or looked at a portfolio of higher education projects over a very long period of time, 2003-2016, covering both the education unit but also other units. And the evaluation did that with as a primary purpose to really understand, get a better understanding of how the support of the World Bank for Higher Education is designed and how it aligns with broader objectives. For the sake of time, I will not go deep into the findings or methodological detail of the evaluation, which I absolutely invite you to consult further, also because I think we really want to leave time for the panel. But I will just do a brief presentation of some of the main findings. And I'll divide my presentation in four main parts, I'll give a couple of facts that, in fact, have already been put on the table on setting a little bit the context. I'll then move a bit to some statistics on World Bank Group support, and then I'll get a little bit to what is a core of the report, which are some of the evaluative findings, and concluding with the recommendations. So I think in terms of the background, I think that has already just been said. Basically, we are really at a moment where the pressure and challenges are piling up on higher education. Higher education is clearly as a crossroad, as demand is growing. And it's growing on both sides, both from students, because there are more and more students, right, completing secondary education and demanding for it, but certainly also from the labor market and an increasingly global labor market where needs for skills, are changing. Now, the growing demand for higher education actually does create challenges at many levels. Here we see our enrollment has been growing, right, over time. And that relates back pretty closely to Jaime's comments. At this moment of time, as enrollment is growing, it is not clear to what extent the education system can actually guarantee quality. I mean, good quality for all. And beyond and related to quality, it is also equally not clear if really the graduates which come out of higher education do have really the skills, are ready really to respond to the needs of the labor markets. At the same time, as enrollment grows, it is also not clear that actually lower income socioeconomic levels are really benefiting from that enrollment growth. So clearly the challenges there are fairly multifold and rather clear. We are speaking about quality, employability, and equity challenges. And the report really delves a little bit into that. Now, against these challenges, the World Bank Group has been engaged and is engaging more and more on higher education. And there are a few statistics which can characterize that engagement and some details about it. What we see is that since 2003, there is a fairly stable number of higher education projects every 3 years, and it's certainly a significant number. In terms of volume, the World Bank has actually invested nearly $12 billion in higher education over the past decade, which is significant. And I certainly do not want to forget IFC. I might be speaking slightly less about IFC here, but let's remember that actually this evaluation was about the World Bank Group, so that definitely includes IFC. IFC is very present also on higher education, with over 700 million spent over the same period. And actually the graph shows both the number of projects for World Bank and IFC. Over a similar period, the higher education lending, in fact, has accounted for about 15 to 25% of the education portfolio. So this is actually quite significant. What we do see in terms of regional distribution is that 4 regions tend to receive a higher education support in terms of volume, starting by Eastern Europe and Central Asia. But we also do see in terms of volume important amounts spent on Africa, Latin America, South Asia. Importantly, what we also do note is that the World Bank support covers a large scope of areas, and that's what the second graph there shows, going from teaching and learning to supporting our education system, access and equity, and other areas. And we are going now to have the opportunity to go deeper into that as I move on in the successive section of my presentation. So here we enter a little bit into what are some of the core evaluative findings of the evaluation. To a large extent, these findings are articulated around some of the key objectives and characteristics of higher education intervention and strategy, and how they align with broader objectives of the World Bank and of higher education. So we will see in particular how they align with the 3 main missions of higher education. On the one side, some of the findings also relate to some core broader transversal areas like governance, monitoring and evaluation, coordination, which are also equally important to ensure effective design and implementation. So starting by one of these core, if you want, transversal area, which is strengthening higher education system, right? This is a pretty transversal dimension. I think everyone recognizes that this is a critical challenge for higher education, to manage to strengthen system, to get stronger system. And as we do look at this dimension, to understand it well, it's really important to start by recognizing that the landscape for higher education is changing, has been changing, and is changing faster and faster. As was actually mentioned, there is a steady growth in private providers everywhere, but especially in lower income countries. And we are now facing a higher education which, in parallel to the increasing globalization, is becoming increasingly internationalized. So when we do look at higher education system and at some of the goals of higher education, it is important, obviously, to keep this landscape in mind. Now, the report looked at the World Bank Group strategy for education and for higher education, and actually did find that there is really a strong coherent set of strategy, but they might need some adjustment to be kept updated to continue to reflect this rapidly changing context. The report also looked at the intervention themselves, at the projects from the perspective of higher education system, and does find that I would say a healthy 25% of projects include governance as an objective. And when they include governance, those projects, to a large extent, look at supporting regulatory framework and university autonomy. The report acknowledges that this is welcome. The focus on governance is welcome. In particular, as I just said, the landscape becomes increasingly complicated. But there is still scope to be doing more, and in fact, I've just heard about that just now. There is also scope to be doing more. There's still scope to be doing more, notably to ensure adequacy and quality of whole higher education institutions, both public and private. This is still work in progress. So I think this is clearly an important finding of the report. Now, the report also acknowledges and reiterates that it is somewhat difficult to generalize. A higher education system face different challenges and priority according to the country, and in a way invites also for a further contextualization as well of governance interventions, but also posits that wherever we go, higher education plays an important role. And that brings me to this other set of findings, which relate more particularly to how the higher education project align with the key missions of higher education. And here there is nothing really new. The report uses a framework detailing the missions of higher education, which is fairly used and across the world, which is considered that higher education has three main missions, which is basically preparing students for the future. So it's a teaching and learning really mission of higher education, and how to ensure that there is good quality with employability for all. While at the same time, higher education also clearly has a second mission, which is the one of creating knowledge and innovation. So that relates to research, the role that higher education can have in creating, producing, adopting research. And finally, a third mission, which the report also explores, is a one of to what extent the university actually playing a role in supporting community collaboration, creating social cohesion. So I will briefly review these three main areas and how, in a way, the portfolio relates to that. Access and equity, I think the report reiterates how important it is to continue mitigating some of the undesirable distributional consequences that, high focus on higher education can have. As I've just said, increase in enrollment, it doesn't necessarily mean that the lower income have seen or have experienced such an increase. So this is an important priority. Now, the report does find that with some important exceptions, access and equity have not necessarily been a major area of focus of bank operations over that time period. We are speaking of the time period 2003-2016. It does find that increasing participation was an objective in 20% of operation. And it does also find that targeting by income, gender, ethnicity occurred in 1/3 of operations, which, might not necessarily be sufficient to address equity concerns. Now, the report also finds that there are many cases where the project's intervention used subsidized loans, scholarships, and some of those particular specific interventions have actually had interesting results, useful results. In particular, there have been case studies done on how subsidized loan, have been used to really improve access of the lower income quintile. On the IFC side, the report finds that a lot of the investments were actually focused on middle and lower income students with limited access to subsidized education. That's more typical of the IC model of engagement in higher education. What happens on the quality and employability? Quality and relevance are more common objectives, much more widespread objectives of higher education operations in the World Bank Group. They often are predominantly addressed by through improvement in the learning environment, faculty qualification, curriculum, and quite reliant also on the use of grants to universities. Grants, competitive, non-competitive, to spur research, to spur teaching and learning, are a tool which is extremely widely used in higher operation projects. And the report argues or provides a little bit of a discussion on the pro and con of that, of maybe that over-reliance on grants to pursue those quality and relevance objectives. The report also highlights that as we look at both quality and employability, there is still scope to increase linkages between the higher education world and the productive world, employers. Overall, it does find that across all operations, linkage between university and industry are not necessarily emphasized. And so there's certainly need to be more perspective from employers. And we have just heard that seems to be highly relevant if graduates need to have more relevant skills. So this is about increasing the role more of employer, but also of the private sector more broadly within higher education. Now, in terms of the other two missions, and maybe going slightly faster as I'm conscious of the time, the report does find that research activity are also fairly widespread in higher education projects in the World Bank Group, and often supported through competitive grants. Again, I'd say that support graduate and student faculty, provide equipment, facilitate research partnership. Increasingly, there have also been cases of research grant that focus on science and technology topics. Now, so I won't necessarily, because the panel won't necessarily delve too much into that, so I think I'll stop here on that particular mission. Certainly invite you to further consult the report. On the third mission, the report does find that the bank support to university and community collaboration is quite limited. There isn't much that is being done along that third mission of using university and higher education institutions to build more social cohesion. There isn't much. So it's fairly limited. Let me then finish this presentation on my findings, getting back to a couple of transversal areas. As I've said at the beginning, there are kind of three more transversal core dimensions, extremely important to ensure more effective design implementation. I spoke about governance. Let me say a couple of words now on knowledge and monitoring and evaluation, and I will conclude on coordination. There appears to be, and to be fair, not only in the World Bank Group, less rigorous evidence on teaching and learning and what it takes in general to produce higher quality for higher education than for other level of education. There is clearly still a knowledge gap, and the report highlights that dimension, which therefore raises the scope and the need for scaling up and strong potential, maybe for pioneering more and better use of knowledge. At the same time, the report also finds that the quality of the results indicator used within the results framework of higher education project is not yet what it should be vis-à-vis the use, in particular, of input-output versus outcome measures. Often, results frameworks stop at what we call proxies for quality, like quality of faculty, or without necessarily attempting, for instance, to measure employability in a broader sense. And related to that is also the relatively limited use of tracer study, who actually could have a strong potential to track student employability outcomes. So there seems to be more scope in general to build more evidence, to continue building more evidence and finding new measures to measure outcomes. And finally, as I was mentioning about coordination, the report also looks at internal and external coordination. And that's fine that there is actually a fairly high level of internal communication between the World Bank and the FC and the education global practice and the various education units, also between IFC and the World Bank. However, there seems to be less coordination among global practice overall, meaning that many higher education projects, for instance, actually are part of projects which are in other practices, in other units. And this is where there is limited collaboration because, for instance, those projects don't necessarily count with participation of education experts. So there seem to be, higher education is by nature quite cross-sectorial. It's dealt with through different units, but there don't seem to be necessarily enough coordination at this level. And there is also recognition that in terms of the donor landscape, it's actually fairly different than for other education levels, with a significant, notably, presence of what we call non-traditional donors. And in that setting, there could be scope also to create more collaborations with some of those non-traditional donors. And recently, the World Bank has been exploring actually further contacts with a spectrum of finances and could build on that. So as I've completely now finished my allocated time, I would just like to finish up on what are the 5 main recommendations of the report. I mean, the first one about acting strategically invites the World Bank to further think about some of the objectives and goals it really wants to achieve in higher education. And some of it relates back to some of the possible inherent trade-off between doing maybe more on equity. As we have seen, it is an area which is quite underrepresented, and maybe less on some other things. So it invites the World Bank to think critically and strategically about the pathway ahead for higher education. The second recommendation is more relates to that issue of quality and employability, and invites really teams to involve the private sector more at different levels of the design and implementation of projects. There is a call to develop evidence. And finally, suggestion and recommendation to continue improving the conversation also within the bank group across the different practices, and work increasingly in partnership with other donors and development institutions, as really higher education concerns us all. And I think everybody has at stake really making it more effective. So let me finish here and thank you all.
Thank you, Emanuela. I would like to invite the panel to the podium. We've heard that we're all concerned by higher education. We also have all gone through the system of higher education. So I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and lots of interest. I understand some colleagues are following up online. So if you are following up online, you can also follow up on Twitter at Higher Ed for Dev, and you can send questions to us through Paul Ev at paulev.com/IEG now. So let me start by introducing our panel, distinguished panel. To my far right, we have Roberta Marley-Bassett, who is Senior Tertiary Education Specialist, probably one of the rare people who have gone through the system, and is also an expert of higher education, unlike the rest of us who have just gone through the system and suffered through it. Roberta is currently working on many aspects of higher education, especially on equity and benchmarking of tertiary education institutions, and has contributed to many projects across the world, including on countries such as Malaysia, Ukraine, Thailand, and also on ranking of education institutions. Welcome to the panel, Roberta. Then we have Eva Egron-Polak, whom we welcome to the bank today as a guest, but pretty sure it's not the first time you come to the bank, Eva. Eva is former Secretary General of the International Association of Universities and currently Senior Fellow in the same institution. Eva launched a number of initiatives whilst Secretary General of the IAU on higher education policy, both concerning research and policies and internationalization of higher education systems and providing equitable access to all. She's written many papers and taught also on the issues. Then to my left, I have Keiko, a colleague of ours in the bank. Keiko is Education Practice Director, working with Jaime. And Keiko was manager for education in South Asia before taking her new position. And she works also on education projects in many regions, too long to mention, but one of them is Africa, East Asia, and Central Asia. So you've worked almost in all the regions in the bank, Keiko. In addition to that, Keiko has also worked with many governments in the countries, interacting directly with them in countries such as Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and Laos. So welcome to the panel, Keiko. And then finally, we have Salvador Malvo Alvarez, engineer and expert in higher education and also evaluator. So probably the only person in the room who combined Caroline and Jaime's expertise in one. He's currently Director General of Higher Education in the Ministry of Education in Mexico. And Salvador was, he led the Mexican National Center for Education, for Evaluation of Higher Education, and was Director General of the National Council for Certification and Competencies. And he has also written numerous papers and taught on the issue of higher education. So welcome to our panel, distinguished panel. I think based on the brief we have prepared, we're supposed to focus our conversation on quality and employability, one key aspect of Emanuela's presentation. But many of you have worked on equity and access as well, so feel free to bring that expertise into the conversation. I would like to start by asking the first question to Eva. So Eva, higher education is becoming increasingly global, as we learned in the various introduction, from Caroline to Jaime to Emanuela, they all touched upon this issue. And technology is also becoming very ubiquitous in almost every country. We have it. And so there is this kind of convergence between higher education and technology. So I'll be interested in hearing your views on the benefits and challenges posed by this globalization of higher education and the role you see institutions like yours playing in helping us reap the benefits that will come with this, both globalization and ubiquitous technology everywhere.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much. Thanks, first of all, for having me as part of this panel on a very broad topic, because I did stick to the title, and I thought about the title, The Future of Higher Education in the Global Economy, and the question of globalization of higher education. And I'd like to just start first by thinking about globalization, period. And when I started thinking about it, I decided to listen to some sessions at the Davos meeting. And I didn't go, but I went and listened, and I looked for something on higher education, on research. There wasn't a single session during Davos that focused on that. But what caught my attention was one session that was entitled Saving Economic Globalization from Itself.
Yes, I remember that.
Very intriguing topic, and I listened very carefully, and one comment made by the Minister of the Economy in Colombia struck me as important not only for globalization tout court, but also for higher education. And he said there were three things that needed to be put in place to save globalization from itself. He called them, the three, a safety net. And for him, they were three things. One was compensation for those who lose in economic globalization, complementary goals and complementary agendas, and he mentioned the SDG 2030 agenda, and third, making sure that education and training opportunities are put in place for developing countries so that they do not regress through globalization. And I think that in higher education, that same safety net is something we really need to consider and focus on. And maybe even more so in higher education, because that's where the people are educated and trained so that they can put the other safety nets in place. Without that higher education capacity and the highly educated people, those safety nets may not be put in place. So what are the benefits and what are the challenges of globalization in higher education? Well, I think many of us know some of the benefits and some of the challenges. First, obviously, becoming more interconnected through technology and through mobility gives us the opportunity, gives everyone the opportunity for mutual learning. So we can learn from good practices elsewhere, and we can understand better different contexts and different conditions. It also gives us an opportunity to understand people better cultural differences, etc. Whoops.
Oops,
It's okay.
We'll get it.
It brings potential capacity development, human resource development through mobility, through partnerships, sharing of programs, through open educational resources, massive online courses to some extent. So there's a lot of potential benefit. There's more visibility and consciousness through globalization of higher education of the major challenges in the world, issues of poverty, issues of climate change, health epidemics, etc. Through a more globalized higher education system, everyone tends to be exposed to those challenges. And of course, there are networking opportunities, and there's an opportunity for sharing resources, in particular in research. But of course, there are risks, and that's why I started with the safety net, because I think there are many risks connected to the globalization of higher education. I think we've seen increased competition between higher education institutions and between systems of higher education. There's an increase in the commercial motivation for choices being made by higher education institutions in terms of the activities they choose, the partners they choose, even some of the disciplines they focus on, both locally, domestically, and internationally. The spread of global rankings has had a huge influence everywhere. I think there is also much more stratification in the systems of higher education, which is rather different from diversification, which I think is very positive and which I think was discussed already by Jaime. Stratification is very different, and I think there's more of it, and it is in part caused by globalization. I'd also argue that we don't have a globalized higher education. We have a very small subsystem, a small global landscape. There are many, many countries and many institutions that are left out of that globalized sector. Finally, I have lots more, but I'm going to be short. I think there's another danger of globalization, and that is policy mimicry. I think every policymaker, every minister looks at his colleagues, not necessarily those who exist in similar conditions, but those that he would like to or she would like to imitate. And they do adopt policies that are often not fitting for the context. And that policy mimicry, I think, can steer systems as well as institutions. It happens at higher education institutions as well, to potentially making inappropriate and sometimes very costly decisions. So one of the questions you asked was also, what can agencies do? And I think that there's a lot that global agencies, such as UNESCO and the World Bank, can do by bringing together platforms, by putting in place platforms of dialogue that include some of the higher education institutions and their associations, like the one I used to work in. Also some of the specialized organizations. There is an International Organization for Quality Assurance, INQUAHE. There are many bilateral agencies that work on the global scale. I think UNESCO and the World Bank, or one of them, or both of them, could put in place platforms where we have a dialogue, an opportunity to share some of the concerns and look at what lessons we can draw. I think if civil society and the employer can be part of those dialogues, I think all the better. But I think that's a very important possibility that agencies and international organizations should be considering. Because if we talk about globalization, there's no global governance in higher education, but the trends are calling for some kind of safety net to be considered, and only through that kind of dialogue can we get there.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Eva. I would like to turn to Salvador to bring it to a country level and hear from you on what globalization brings as opportunities for increasing or improving the quality of higher education in Mexico, and how do you take into account globalization in your policy making?
Well, thank you. I would like to start again repeating my thanks to the International Evaluation Group and to the World Bank for being here. I think it's rather proper that you ask me that question, in the sense that Mexico is a country that faces both the challenges of the future and the challenges of the past. I usually use myself as a yardstick for that development, and that tells you my age and other things. When I was a student in university in Mexico, I was one of 1.7% of the students of the young people of my age that were attending a university. Of course, I didn't realize that when I was there. I didn't notice that I was a privileged person. I simply was attending university. But certainly I have seen the statistics, and I was one of 1.7% of the group, the age group that was attending university. Now we are around 37%, 38, the group that is attending university. And the country has multiplied itself in 3 times fold in that period. That is, we have passed from being 40 million people to being 120 million people in that same period. So yes, I can see that higher education has become a very important factor in Mexico. But at the same time, even of the fast growth, I can see that there are many, many, many people that didn't reach higher education and that they are working and trying to earn a living. I was talking at lunch time that we have in Mexico certainly 30 million people that didn't finish high school. And if I consider those that actually finished high school, we have about 50 million people that didn't earn a upper secondary degree. And they have to earn their living in a society which is supposed to be in a knowledge society. So that gives you the contradictions that we have regarding higher education and regarding the policies that we should follow in higher education in a certain country, in this particular case, my country. But I think in hearing the conversation, and hearing the different views, I find that the contradictions that Saavedra was saying, for example, the contradictions between what is the mission of higher education or what is the mission of education has existed all over. It's just that we are part of a heritage that we have seen this growth in higher education at a period in which higher education is dominated by a certain view, which Saavedra was saying, the university view of higher education. Let me try to show you an example of what I'm saying, to try to be clearer, because my English is not as good as it should be. I like very much to read about higher education, and I read, for example, Alfred Northrop Whitehead in his book, Aims of Education. That was about 100 years ago, 1928. It's 90 years ago. He wrote that. And at the same time, Werner Jaeger wrote a book called Paideia, which was the education of the classical Greece. And they have a definition of education quite different from each other. Both of them are beautiful to hear and very pointed, but they are quite different. Whitehead says that education is nothing but to teach the rigor of intellect, develop the appreciation of beauty, and start a sensibility to the pain of the others. I'm sorry that I cannot say it as beautiful as it's written, so it's a beautiful definition of education. Whitehead, on the other side, says education is the principle that by which every country that has reached a certain level of development tries to transmit the goals and aspirations, both physical and spiritual, to the next generation. Both of them are beautiful definitions. It's a problem when you try to operationalize, when you try to put them into practice. How do you do that? That brings the problem. But if we analyze these two definitions, they tell you two different things. The mission that Whitehead is trying to convey is that To be an educated person is to be cultured, to know, to be able to talk about certain things in order to be a better person. The vision of Jäger is completely different. The vision of Jäger is first you have to eat. First you have to have something, and then you can nurture yourself to become something. I think this conflict, this dichotomy of view of higher education, of education in general, is still pervading us. We still feel that university education is somewhat better than technical education. We still feel better that it's better to have a degree or a discipline than to know how to make a bridge or to build something or to perform something. So this contradiction is still haunting us and is still making our decisions very difficult. Especially, and that's why I started with Mexico, especially when you have to realize that what do you have to invest in higher education if you have 4.5 million students, that's the case of Mexico, in higher education, and at the same time you have 45 million people that have to earn a living and they don't have any higher education. What is what you have to do as a country, in what decision you have to make? And of course, the reply is, it has already been said here, you have to make both. You have to do both. You have to try to make the people become better off, and you have to try to make the people contribute to being a better country and a better, and develop a better path. This contradiction, unfortunately, brings us to many difficulties. First of all, the next position is, what is quality in higher education? And if you start thinking about these definitions, you find yourself that you are establishing certain ranks of what is quality higher education by ideals or mores or standards that are not necessarily those applicable to the country and those applicable to the majority of the population. I told you that I was one of 2%, to make it round, 2% of the population that went to university. Now it's 38%, and in certain countries it's 80 or 90%. So do we have to continue teaching in the same way that we talked when there were only 2% or 3% of the population in higher education? Do universities have to continue to do the same thing when this group of people, and I included myself there, really didn't have to worry about their future? And that happened with university teaching and university learning for centuries. Those who attended universities were those that didn't have to worry about their future. They were either noblemen, or they are working as clerks for the royalty, or they were a part of the religious communities. So they had their future assured. So what I'm trying to say is not to diminish university studies, but to say let's try to focus what we need as a country, and we will find that a mix of all these things will be needed and not a single recipe for all of them. And this applies to quality. This applies to quality in the sense that if you need a mixture, a diverse system, to use Eva's words, a diverse system, you have to be able to say that you really have that system as a quality system in all its particular aspects, in all its different subsystems, as she mentioned. And that is very difficult when you are trying to tell the society, don't have your son become a lawyer or a doctor, let him become a technician or an engineer, because he's going to do better. It's very difficult to change society's perception when we have been training them for centuries to say that, no, those that seek to know are better than those that seek to know how to do things or how to apply things. It's a very difficult combination. I'm trying to go faster. The next thing that we have to perceive, and this is the only thing that I really cannot see well reflected in the report. It's a very good report, but I don't see reflected is the potential we have in higher education right now, the potential we have in education. The UNESCO conference of 2009 started with a report written by Philip Albach, Liz Reisberg, and I've forgotten now the third author. And it starts with words like this: higher education has passed in the last 50 years through an academic revolution greater than anything that has happened in higher education, even greater than that happened in the early 19th century when research was introduced into higher education. They are calling it an academic revolution. That is, they are not talking about the numbers. Of course, they mention the numbers of students and so on, but they are not talking about that. They are talking about the centrality of education. What is what we are teaching in higher education? And they are saying this is being transformed. Right now in our presence and in our eyes, higher education is being transformed completely. And what I think is that this is happening, and we need to take advantage of it in order to, especially, to create different avenues of education, different opportunities of higher education, different ways of educating. We don't have to continue establishing a formal link between education and a degree title. I think the future of higher education is going to be that higher education is going to be much more versatile in the way that it's given, the way that it's delivered, the way that it's certified, the way that is evaluated. And I think what we have to do as countries is to try to go as fast as we can in finding the better ways to do it in our different countries in order to assess, to evaluate, and to give higher education. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alvaro. Thank you for this impassionate call to revolutionizing higher education. And in case you had not paid attention, Alvaro has a PhD in physics. And for somebody with a PhD in physics to speak so passionately about the knowledge and know-how side of education is very impressive. I would like to turn now to Roberta. I had two questions for you, and I'm torn as to which one I should ask you first, given what we've just heard. Let me ask you the following question on the role of education institutions. Tertiary education institutions, some of us see them as a very traditional place where you go and learn something, or you go and learn how to do something. So you acquire knowledge, or you acquire know-how. But there are a host of other skills that we need in life to survive, to interact, to have empathy, for others and understand others. Do you think that these are skills that the higher education institution should teach us, or should include in their curriculum?
Thank you very much. Is it okay? Yes, of course. I think the conversation right now about skills and jobs has actually moved us away a bit from this conversation about what does it mean to be an educated, informed person, right? And soft skills actually are transversal not just for the labor market, but for the human condition. Are you a better voter? Are you a better citizen? Do you exist in the world as a good neighbor? Right? I think the bank is actually now looking at higher education as it swings back to thinking about what traditional higher education was, which was philosophy and foreign language and the life of the mind. Right? How can we do both of those things? Because as we move more towards applied skills, we lose some of these broader skills, and we see it in all of our labor market surveys. That's what employers want. They want people who are good thinkers. They want people who can write a good paragraph, who can answer a question thoughtfully. And we need to find a way, as we support universities and tertiary education systems very broadly, as Jaime said, to do that at every level of tertiary education. If you are training to be a plumber, how do you interact with your clients so that you can understand their problems and what they really need to solve them, right? We see them as technical responders, but they actually are interacting with society. And when we focus on universities, it's clearer what universities do. We know that they have a traditional subset of skills that they are trying to impart, but we are looking at tertiary systems quite broadly and hoping that we can support soft and transversal skills across every type of institution that we support in higher education.
Okay, great. Thanks, Roberta. So let me turn now to Keiko. So I hear that the bank is focusing on a new way of thinking higher education in the future, maybe a strategy or maybe a new approach. Can you tell us a bit about your view on the focus areas that the bank should pay attention to in higher education going forward? And if there is any prioritization that you're looking at, what are the factors driving this prioritization? And if you can tell us about some past success stories that you're learning from, in designing your future strategy? That would be interesting as well to the audience. Thanks.
That's a long list of questions.
You can call Jaime to answer.
Yes. But first of all, thank you very much, Auguste and Caroline and Emanuela for organizing this panel. And thanks for the report. And we learned from the report, and we look forward to working with you to address some of the issues. So as you mentioned, indeed, our higher education team is working on the white paper, which will set the strategic direction on tertiary education. So I don't have the answer yet, so what I will share with you is kind of an evolving thinking, and I actually, for full disclosure, I actually crowdsourced some of the ideas for these questions.
Okay, good.
So first and foremost, I think number one is quality / relevance, and relevance.
Okay.
And of course, the question of quality, it's a philosophical question, it's a loaded question, so difficult to define it. But I think given such a rapid increase in higher education enrollment, it's doubled in the last 10, 15 years, and India, Jaime referred to it. So in the last 10 years, India alone, and the higher education institution doubled, and there has been 6.3 higher education institutions newly created every day, including Saturday and Sunday.
Wow.
So today alone, there is a new 6 institution in India alone. So it's just mushrooming everywhere, right? But where is the quality? I think that's just that's the biggest question, and that's where I think the bank really needs to support our client in improving the quality and relevance of what the institution is supporting for their economy, but also for creating responsible citizen. The issue of social emotional skills and empathy, responsible citizen. And related to that, I think one area we should explore looking into is the assessment of that quality. So there is a PISA for 15 years old, there is a PIAC for adult, but for higher education, there isn't much there yet. So some of the successful is a big word, some promising example, for example, is we are working with Stanford to do the assessment of engineering students, to look at their math, physics, quantitative literacy, and also critical thinking. So we can actually compare students, freshmen, second year, third year, fourth year in India, in Russia, and in China, in these 4 aspects. So I think that's something promising area. And in terms of other aspect of quality and relevance, African Center of Excellence is another good example. Center of Excellence approach and really looking into the locally relevant research. And this is now in 17 different countries, 46 centers, so it's expanding quite rapidly. And innovation and research and development. For example, in Bangladesh, they use Fab Lab to teach science and technology. And there is an academic innovation fund to promote, again, the locally relevant research. So there are, I wouldn't say successful, but there are promising examples that we can look into, scale, and adapt to different country examples. So that's the first and foremost most important area, quality and relevance. Other issues, lifelong learning. We are adapting life cycle approach, investing from pregnant mothers to adult population. Learning is a lifelong endeavor, and tertiary education plays an important role in that aspect, not only for the 18 to 22 years old, but for the adult population. And also the issue of equity is a big concern. Tertiary education shouldn't be widening the gap. It should be promoting social mobility for the disadvantaged, for women, for low-income group, for ethnic minority, and even for refugees, displaced population, that's an area that we don't talk about much, but I do believe that education for this refugee group is an important, and disabled students. And then there are financing of tertiary education. There are some innovative approach on performance-based funding, promising areas. In Latvia, for example, that we advise the government on system-wide performance-based as well as institution-based performance-based financing. And lastly, teacher training may not be the most sexy area, but I think it's a really important area that we have a global learning crisis. And to address learning issues in primary and secondary education, teachers are the most important ingredient. And where the teachers train in tertiary education institutions. So their preparation and continuous professional development, tertiary education plays a very important area.
Great. Oh, sorry, keep going. You had finished? Okay, great. Thank you very much, Keiko. I'd like to go back to Roberta for one question, and then I'll see whether you have questions from the floor, and then we'll come back to the panel at some point. So, Roberta, we heard about some ranking, and we even heard Eva saying that this may be a risk to manage, ranking university institutions. You are an expert in that ranking. You've worked a lot on it. So do you think government should use rankings in the first place? And do you think they should take the rankings of universities into their own into account in their policy making?
That's an excellent question. I have to be upfront. I am a big rankings skeptic. And I think a lot of people in this room are. The problem with rankings, so I'm going to say no. I don't think that institutions or countries should be using rankings for policy making or even for institutional planning. I think it's a dangerous metric to take out of context from the methodologies and the structures and the data that are used to underpin the rankings. I think they're very dangerous. I want to go to something that Salvador is doing actually in Mexico and tie this back around, because I think there is one type of ranking that could be incredibly useful for our institutions and for our clients, which is a value-added ranking. What's happening in India and what the Ticket project is doing with Stanford, but also on the institutional level, what Mexican universities are starting to do as well, which is testing the students at entry on certain soft skills, critical thinking, some of the baseline skills you need to be a successful student, and then testing them again in 3 years. And seeing what the institution has contributed to the growth of that student in that period. The US actually has value-added rankings. It does exist here, and they test students on expected outcomes at the time of entry based on SAT scores or GPAs and things like this, and then test them again. Have they persisted at the rates expected? If it's higher or lower, they get ranked on a scaling that way. It actually allows institutions to be seen for mission-driven work that they're doing. If you have more equity enrollments, right? If you're looking at lower quintile students who are going to come in slightly less prepared, how much are you bridging the gaps between what they arrived in and what they are meant to have by the time they complete? At Harvard, you'll see the value added is quite low. They come in extremely well prepared, they leave extremely well prepared. What Harvard did in that period is not particularly notable. What a community college can do, or what a school that's situated in a low-income community can do, a university that is much more focused on the local environment, that bridge could be much more dynamic. And that ranking is actually incredibly useful for stakeholders, for a student to understand what they'll get from that education, for a parent or to understand what they're investing in. So Shanghai is a ranking that looks at research. I mean, it omits most of the global university sector from that. Do you want to say something?
Yeah. You have a 200?
Anyway,
okay.
so yes, I would say they are very dangerous. And nationally, I think rankings actually work in contrast to quality assurance systems, right? If a nation is saying they can guarantee quality to a certain level at all their institutions, that should suffice. You should be able to say with genuine information and metrics to your population, our institutions are good and they've received quality assurance, they've received certain kinds of allowances to operate. If you then start ranking them, you pit your own institutions and say, but this one is better here, right? So it sort of flies in the face of what you're saying you're guaranteeing from a quality assurance environment.
Right. Okay. Eva has a two-hander, so we'll hear
I
from
was
you
just
quickly.
going to say that rankings can actually be very counterproductive, because if you look at the Shanghai or the global rankings, one of the criteria goes against what we've been hearing about, which is equity and equity in access.
Right.
Because how selective you are can raise your standing in the rankings. The second reason why they're very dangerous is because they focus funding very much. They focus it on the few institutions that manage to get into the rankings and leave many others aside, and that's the stratification I talked about. And that also, in certain contexts, is very, very dangerous.
Thank you. Thank you, Eva. So thank you very much. So let me open it up for questions from the floor, if any, and then we'll come back to the panel for a final round of questions. I see a hand up there. Yes, thanks. Yes, and we'll come back to you later. Yes. Yes,
well,
go ahead.
thank you very much for this wonderful panel. My name is Yuan. I work at IFC's Health and Education team. So I have a question for Keiko. You mentioned that promoting social mobility is a core function of higher education, especially for the disadvantaged groups. And then I also observed that in some societies, it is increasingly difficult for people who are born into a poor family to enter a good university and succeed. And especially in China, now we have a lot of discussions on this. So I was wondering if you could address the World Bank Group's approach in designing higher education projects. How do you address this issue? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great question. We can take a second question. Excuse me. You raised your hand? Yes. Sorry.
Yes, my question is,
Sorry, we'll give you the mic because we have some colleagues connected by... Yes, so they could hear you, yes.
Hi, I am Yolanda.
Hi, Yolanda.
My question for Keiko also is that I found extremely interesting all these policies of the bank, taking care of socio-emotional needs, people with disabilities, lifelong learning. But I'm intrigued if you are also working with a new trend, particularly strong in Europe, that is literacy across the curriculum. Is that a priority for the bank, or you have not addressed that?
Okay, great. Thank you. We'll take a third question there, and then we'll come back for...
Thank you for that very interesting discussion. My name is Mary Mulusa. I'm with the IDA Resource Mobilization Team. My question is actually based on what I see happening in my own country, which is Kenya. And I realized as the discussion went, we have slipped back into discussing universities. And my question is this: do you think that the bank and other institutions need to be focusing countries on reinstating a balance between the various levels of tertiary education? Because in Kenya, we've seen all the polytechnics and technical training institutions that fell between the university and the high school slowly swallowed up by universities. And now the competition we have is each region wants to have its own university. So this proliferation of universities across the country, and we've lost this very critical area that used to take up a lot of the students that did not make it to the universities.
Okay, thank you, Mary. So if you don't mind, we'll come back to you later. So Keiko, there were two questions addressed to you, and in fact, there are two other questions addressed to you that came in from Paul Ev, which are related. One is, so I'll read the question to you, and you can answer all of them in, as I go. So there was a question on lifelong learning. Should institutions also train mid-career professionals beyond technical skills and beyond traditional skills? And there is also a question on life skills. So should institutions teach other things such as how to manage your personal finances, how to stay healthy, how to pay taxes? So, it's a long list, but bottom line is, what should the institution really teach, and what should the bank support?
This is like a university, your dissertation.
comprehensive examination. Anyway, so starting with the social mobility, I think we need to start early, right? We need to start from primary, from EC, early childhood development, primary, secondary, so that the disadvantaged group have the opportunity, the access to learning at the earlier stage, and they move up the system. And on tertiary education specifically, yes, we do have engagement to promote the enrollment or the access to disadvantaged group. For example, in Odisha in India, we're targeting the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe to increase the access to higher education through scholarships and so forth. And similarly, for women, we do that in many of the countries through scholarship, conditional cash transfer, and so forth. So the answer is yes. And literacy, so the question is, do we invest in literacy?
In emotional,
social emotional
needs.
Using all the subjects of schooling from K to 20. And now there is an important trend saying, as we nurture also the bodies of the people, we need to nurture the language competencies, which means that every discipline in all the curriculum needs to put some attention into language development skills, not just the subject matter itself. And that is particularly strong in Europe, the European community. So my question is if the bank has addressed that issue yet, or is not important at this point.
We definitely invest in early grade reading in our basic education support, that we want to make sure that the children have the ability to read and write. And in terms of literacy skills for adults, that's a very challenging area, and there's a big demand, especially from Africa and South Asia. And to be honest, we don't have a great solution yet, but this is an area definitely we are going to work on. Not entirely sure.
So, yeah, maybe we can move to Salvador on the question on university versus other institutions. You know, I'm turning to you because you kind of challenged a bit Jaime on his. Well, I mean, you're too polite, but that's how I understood it. You know, Jaime was saying, yeah, there's some, you know, learning that happens in universities and some that happens in technical institutions. You know, I call it knowledge and versus know-how. Maybe I'm not fully capturing things here. But the question I heard from the floor is, you know, in the case of Kenya, for example, you know, universities are doing their job and then technical institutions are being created and there seems to be a sense of competition or displacement. Is it something that you're seeing in Mexico? And in general terms, going back to your classification of the skills that we need to learn and the definition of education that you gave us, is there really a real dichotomy between universities and technical institutions? And if there is, how is it hurting our accumulation of skills for the labor market?
Well, first, the answer, yes, is there is a dichotomy the society perceives technical institutions different than they perceive universities. Mm-hmm. And there is a tendency in the same way, apparently, as in Kenya, to perceive that universities are better institutions in general, and therefore universities have the loudest saying in what should happen in higher education, and probably that also receive the greatest amount of money to develop. So yes, if that's the question regarding the dichotomy existing in Mexico, yes, it is. There are many policies that are trying to erase that dichotomy, but it's still existing there. The polytechnics, like the old one, the Instituto Politécnico Nacional, which was the largest and longest, now it has become much more a university than a polytechnic in many ways, although it still contains certain subject matters that, and certain skills that are properly attached to a technical institution. But yes, as a whole, I think the same happens as in Kenya, in Mexico. what I was trying to say, I was not challenging Jaime, not because I wouldn't do it. What I was trying to say is that we live, and I involve the whole world in a contradiction regarding what should be higher education about. Mm-hmm. And what I was trying to say is that the future tells us that higher education is ever more changing into different patterns in different ways and different views, and that we have to assess quality in a way that is trying not to be too philosophical. I'm not going into that. I'm going to say that you have to assess quality in a way that it's that you assess whether the institution is fulfilling what it promises to fulfill, mm-hmm. and you ask evidence for that. Mm-hmm. If they are doing that, if they are providing what they say they are providing, and people want to go there, then I think they are proper institutions, even proper higher education institutions, and probably some of them very good higher education mm-hmm. institutions, even though we don't like it. Perhaps, let's say a cooking school, and I'm not criticizing cooking, I'm saying as an example, if you say this school where you create chefs and so on, well, if they have people that attend that school and they actually make them good chefs, I think they are doing a good job. I think in regarding the question that is placed here, whether the universities have to do to teach finance, personal finance, and how to stay healthy or how to pay taxes, I think if there are institutions, higher education institutions, that provide services to do that, and they clearly say that they are saying or providing those services, and they actually do it, and you can assess them, then they are good quality institutions. What I'm trying to say is we don't have to fall into one single type of institution of higher education, which at present is universities. That doesn't mean that I want universities to disappear. I'm not saying that. I think universities have a place. But what I try to say is that within my lifetime, we changed from 2% to 38%. I don't think that 36%, let's say, has to have the same education as the 2%. I don't care if I am part of the 2% or part of the 36%. I think it's false that we are getting a better system just by creating more and more and more and more universities. I think we have to diversify higher education institutions, and we have to assess them on what they provide. And if what they provide is true, then I think we should call them, we should say that they are good higher education institutions. I don't know if I answered your question. You did. Thank you very much, Alberto. So I'm told that we need to close very, very soon. I promise to come back to you with your question, so I don't want to leave it out. So if you can ask your question quickly, and then I'll come back to the panel for closing remarks.
So we recently reviewed the human development strategy for the bank with the board. And it talked a lot about the same issues of equity, skills development, cost effectiveness, and so forth, social mobility. When we discussed that at the senior management team, the managing director from China reminded us that our very first investments in China were in higher education. And then he went on to say education emancipated his country. And he chooses his words very carefully, and he said emancipated. And he meant that those investments helped connect China to ideas outside. It helped them bring in technology, develop their own technology. It gave them the confidence to go forward, and it gave them sort of the skills they needed to develop the country. He said, put those other debates aside for now and think fundamentally, why are we investing in the sector and what significance does it have? When you look at the whole portfolio of education, or even our decisions to invest in higher education, do you think we have a coherent view on the role that higher education plays in development? Are we able to communicate that? Do we give the projects a good starting point, framework to think about what they might invest in and how they might invest?
Okay, good. Thanks. Good question. Very challenging. So, of course, we'll leave that question to Roberta and Keiko. But so we'll come to each of you for your closing remarks. In your closing remark, in addition to answering this last question, if you can also tell us what you think about how the private sector can play a role in higher education in terms of helping define the curriculum, maybe helping finance, and so that there is a clear, better connection between the output of the education system and what is needed in the job market, so that a student can be prepared for the future. It's important because the bank now is preparing a WDR on the future of work. So I think what you will say today on this point will resonate with the colleagues working on the WDR. So let's start with you, Evo, with your closing remarks.
I'm going to be somewhat provocative because I think that the focus on employability is extremely narrow. And in part, my sense is that it is that strong focus on employability that blurs the line between university and vocational and technical education. Because if we push all the universities, I work mostly in universities, towards demonstrating a linear equation between the education and employability, we are pushing them to become much more training organizations rather than education organizations. So to me, the focus on employability is a little bit dangerous because it also focuses very clearly on the short term rather than on the long term. And I think that we know that the mismatch, so-called mismatch between skills and the job market is real, but we also know that even as little as 5 years from now, millions of jobs will disappear. So we can't just focus on providing education for the current labor market. We need to prepare people for the jobs that don't exist, as was already said. But what does that mean? That means that they have to be continuously capable of learning, continuously adaptable, and for that they need a very broad education, not skills development per se. On the question itself, universities, and again, I work for university, or I did all my life work with universities. They already do a lot with employers. There are many institutions that use professionals in their curriculum design as visiting faculty. They're on their boards, so they are steering the organizations. So they already do that. There's an awful lot of, and more so, and I think this is really positive, internships and co-op programs in universities. Excellent ways of introducing learners into the labor market as they're studying. So there's a lot. The one thing I think that we need to consider is that no employer, or very few employers, let's put it that way, very few employers will position their advice to universities and higher education institutions in the long term. We need to figure out a way to make that dialogue with employers to be much more forward-looking, much more foresight than immediate. And one, I think, way to perhaps do it is to organize sectoral discussions. Where does this industry go in the next 15, 20 years? And what education and what skills may this sector, broadly speaking, need? Because that's the only way we may, and I don't say we will, I'm saying we may, be able to prepare our graduates to handle the changes that we are not expecting yet.
Okay, great, thank you. Roberta, you want to go next? Thanks.
Actually, I'm going to answer Chris's question as well from someone whose entire work program is higher education. I think that the question about does the bank have a clear direction for higher education is a fantastic question, because I think I know we argue internally about what the direction for higher education should be. I think the bank has been on its back foot for a long time about tertiary education, defensive about the rate of return arguments that are seen around the world as having put limitations on the development of tertiary education in much of the world and spending decades to try to fix the mistakes that might have been made with that argument. And now we sit in a space where it's a dialogue of, is it employment outcomes that we want? Is it whole citizen development that we want? Do we want diversification with articulation in the sector? Do we want to focus on world-class universities? We internally are having these debates. Of course, we're still having them externally as well. But what's happening under Jaime and with Omar is this white paper on higher education, which is going to focus much more attention and dialogue internally among all of the higher education active staff to have a conversation about really what are our clients asking for, what do they believe they need, what do we believe that they need, and how can we make all of these things fit into a cohesive strategic direction for the future. We didn't have that in the WDR. It didn't focus post-secondary. The skills work, WDR will have some on higher education, but not much. And so the white paper really is going to be the thing that brings us to the next phase. And then I want to, with the lifelong learning question that somebody asked, in ECHA, where I work in the Europe and Central Asia region, the demographics are actually putting extreme pressures on public universities to exist, to maintain their operations because the populations are shrinking. So lifelong learning is actually giving a lifeline to universities to continue offering to traditional and non-traditional students what they do best to stop closures of universities. And it really is supporting sectors as a whole to continue operating. In other places, I mean, in the United States, lifelong learning does happen also in public universities and private universities, quite frankly. But there are some places where it's actually vitally important for the safety and health of the tertiary sector to keep lifelong learning as something that more and more is part of the operations of the universities and other institutions.
Great. Thank you very much, Roberta. Alvaro, shall we go to you? And then Keiko will close.
I think that what we have to realize is that higher education is becoming for everyone. We are having every time more and more people demanding higher education in any way. So we have to provide access to all the groups in all the different countries and provide them with education that is meaningful, significant for what they need. It's up to them to choose if they want a more utilitarian education or a less utilitarian, more academic education. But what we have to do as a country is to provide opportunities for almost everyone and try to grow in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Keiko, your final words. And also if you can say what you're going to do differently after all you've heard.
What I heard?
Yes.
Well, definitely we will, not differently, we will continue on the work of the white paper, but I was thinking a similar thing. 100 years ago, probably basic or secondary education was for the privileged, and now it has become universal. So probably 50 years from now, 100 years from now, tertiary education, maybe 50, right, become universal. No matter what. And it has to become diversified as well because people have different needs and different country has different needs. So we ready as a World Bank to be able to support that diversified higher education to meet different needs of the client. And I think that's what we need to look and discuss at the global practice. But I do think it's an extremely exciting agenda, and I don't think we need to be defensive at all. This from the client, it's a given already in many, many countries. So I think we really need to engage in this discussion with our country team.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Please join me in giving in thanking the panel.